I'd like to welcome everyone to the mini conference, the pre-symposium mini conference, whatever we're calling it officially. Topic of today's program is new insights into calf performance. A couple of housekeeping items. One, if you would please turn off your cell phones or at least place them on vibrate for as a courtesy to our speakers. I think everybody's familiar with there's always at least one person in the room that forgets to turn it off and it goes off. But anyway, please double check those. We will have a 15-minute refreshment break at the halfway point, so hang in there. We'll get there. At the conclusion of today's mini symposium, we do have an open invitation to everyone in the room to join us for barbecue and beverages. That will be held out by the poolside. So we hope that everyone will take the opportunity to come on out and join us and visit with us. We appreciate that. So, get started. Our first speaker today is Dr. Bob James. Dr. James is fairly recently retired from one of my old alma maters, Virginia Tech. From the dairy extension, he was the dairy extension project leader as well as having responsibilities for teaching and research. His research focused on management of growing calves and heifers, and most recently it focused on managing on-farm pasteurizers and calf automated feeding systems. After retiring, Bob established a consulting service, which has got a neat name of Down Home Heifer Solutions. Bob also works very closely with the GPS Consulting Nutrition Group located out of the Midwest. I should also point out that Bob is one of the founding members of the Dairy Calf and Heifer Association. So please take a moment to welcome Dr. Bob James.
It's a real pleasure to be here. I don't know if Mike Van Amberg has come in here yet at all or not. I'm just telling our sponsors, this is the first time I've worn a tie in about 4 years. And the only reason I did is because of Van Amberg. And so, anyway, it's a real pleasure to be here. And had the invitation of Vulcan to come here. We did this at the Cornell Nutrition Conference, great program. I am passionate about calves. I really enjoy it. And it's really nice to be inspired and keep on doing things that you like to do. Anyway, if we look at what's the typical response when you ask a producer, hey, how are your calves doing? How many deads do you have? You know, that's pretty embarrassing. It's really pretty doggone embarrassing, but that's typically the response that you get because it's pretty easy to measure, isn't it? Okay? There's different perspectives on calf performance, and I think each one of these parties sometimes has a different perspective. There's the calf, there's the feeder, okay? Isn't it nice to feed calves down here in Florida in June, July, and August, September? Okay, I was in South Dakota 2 weeks ago on a calf ranch. The high was -8. You know, just really, so what's the objective of that calf feeder? How quickly can I get done? Okay? Then there's for the manager, and sometimes we have the owner is different from the manager, and then I think we also need to think about the consumer. We need to think about the consumer as well, because if we're going to set some performance standards, they need to be something I think that the consumer can identify with as well. So what should dictate our standards for calf performance? Longevity of the animal, high lifetime production, low cost per unit of production, profit. You know, got to be able to make money. It's kind of interesting. I think the general public thinks maybe that's a sin sometimes, but to try and make some money. By the way, those of you in the back, if you're sitting back there, you're not safe, and I know Van Amberg kind of wanders around too, but I'll make the circuit here. Unfortunately, conditions in the short term, I had to cross out May, and I said, influence our decisions on goals for calf performance. Things are tight right now, and boy, nothing is sacred. Everybody's looking at ways where they can make cuts in our costs. And so we get in a situation like this, so what's the lesser of two evils? That grizzly bear or jumping off the cliff, okay? And sometimes we run into those scenarios. So, cutting calf rearing expenses. Why calves? Boy, people look at particularly if they're feeding milk replacer, how much that dead gum bag of milk replacer costs. And what it costs me per day for feeding that calf is really expensive. And it really burns into the mind of producers. Not so much when they're using waste milk or even tank milk. You know, I kind of learned about that when I retired, because when I worked for the university, you got your paycheck, you know? I tell you what, when you started working for yourself and you wrote that check every quarter to Uncle Sam, it kind of strikes home a little bit harder, okay? And that's the analogy that I use with waste milk and feeding milk out of the tank. It's money you don't see, okay? It's money you don't see, and I say you need to charge that just the way you do if you're feeding milk replacers. But it's a hidden cost for a lot of producers. If we look at low milk prices, we want to cut rearing costs, cost per day, cost per pound, or kilogram per day. And some calf ranches are actually moving in this direction and looking at, let's lower our cost per unit of gain, and that's an entirely different picture. Now, pre-weaning feed costs. This was a study done in Germany. They had calves that were either fed whole milk ad lib, milk replacer ad lib, or a restricted milk replacer program. Now, 2 points here. The percent of the total feed cost for that whole milk protein was 18% of the total rearing cost. If they went to milk replacer, they could cut a little bit of expenses. If they went to a restricted feeding program of somewhere around 6 liters of milk a day, they didn't save all that much money. They didn't save all that money, and that's just looking at rearing expenses. So if we look at industry pressures, in the calf ranch model, it's cost per day. That's what producers are paying. Do you know what the going rate is in Kansas right now, western Kansas? $2.50 a day. You got, I think it's $14 milk and you want to feed 2 gallons a day, that's right at $2.40. Okay, so what's left over? Not much. Not much. It's expensive. So what are the costs in raises heifers? What do we gain by improving efficiency in heifer management? We have KPIs for the milking enterprise. What kind of KPIs do we have for heifers and calves? And hopefully that's something we're going to talk a little bit about today. So why? The calf enterprise is viewed as a cost center. I like to do the analogy, it's like your in-laws visiting, okay? They eat all your food, complain, and you get nothing back in return, okay? And that's the problem we have with calves. And the objective on a lot of places, boy, how can I cut my costs? Because that's all they see. But there's a delayed impact to that, and I think those things are becoming more obvious now. So if we cut those expenses to the point where we're barely supporting maintenance requirements of that animal, boy, there's not much left over for supporting gain or supporting the immune system. You know, a gallon of milk a day, particularly even in Virginia, we're not even meeting our maintenance expenses. So we're going to start mobilizing. We're down to 2.5% body fat. And then we start breaking down protein and we wind up with a really immune compromised animal. And I think we are seeing more and more research which supports the impact that replacement performance has on animal performance and farm profit. But it's still a battle. It's still a battle because we're spending that money now and we may not see that response until the future. I'd like to draw upon this for a couple of reasons. This was a study done by Jason Karzes. He's got 17 herds. He's not repeated this since 2012, but the points I want to make I think are still very valid. And his data set involves some larger herds, 636 heifers in those farms, and they range from 333 to about 1,300. Their age at calving average was 23, so pretty good herds, but with a range of 20 to 25. Very good size. Their total weight gain on the farm from about 950 to almost 1,300. Average daily gains from 1.5 to almost 2 pounds a day. Percent non-completion rate. That's a big expense that people don't look at. And it went from 4% to 18%. Now that non-completion rate means some reason or other they were culled or died, but we've got to take all those expenses back onto the survivors, and that can be very expensive. But the point is, look at the differences that we see. Now I'm not going to go through all of these, but I want to focus on the big ones. Feed is the big one, 53%. The range was $1.30 to $2 a day. Labor is another big one, 12%. But we look beyond those two, and then we have building operation and ownership, and that's probably a little bit higher in New York than it is in other places of the country. And then we have interest on investment, and those are our big expenses. But look at the range that we have in these expenses. On labor, from 21 cents to 51 cents a day. If we look at health expenses, from 3 cents to about 13 cents a day. A lot of differences in those expenses. So my cost per day per animal, about $3 with a range of $2.66 to $3.43. You know, think about that calf ranch in western Kansas at $2.50 a day. I wouldn't send my calves there, because you know they're cutting everything right smack to the limits. If I look at my cost per pound of gain from $1.50 to $1.89. And anyway, my point is showing some of the ranges that we have in these things, and what do those people do to achieve those levels of efficiency. Whoops. There we go. So if we look at stages of growth, and we're here to focus on the calves, so $3.13 a day for those calves from birth to 200 pounds. That represents about 15% of the total cost, about 8% of the total growth. Okay? So boy, what's the impact if that's where we put our bullet on? We're trying to save money. If I'm going to save money, boy, there's where I really want to focus, is those great big ones that are eating a lot of dry matter a day. And how do I do that? By having some pretty good repros so that they aren't too old when they freshen. If we look at this graphically, high impact areas. The blue is the cost per day. The whatever this color is, purple, is the cost per pound of gain. And again, very, very expensive, but also look at where our labor is. Look at where our labor expenses. So if I'm going to focus on some things, there's where we've got to look at how do we get our biggest bang for the buck. Okay, maybe not the lowest cost, but our biggest thing from the dollar. So what do we know about the impact of calf management on later performance? And Dr. Van Amberg is going to talk a little bit about this. I'm just going to touch upon some key things here. He didn't come back in right when I made my presentation. Notice I have a tie on today, Mike Van Amberg. The only reason I wore this is because I knew that you were going to have one, and I didn't want to look like some slaps from Virginia, okay? So this is your fault. Anyway, here's an impact on longevity and productivity in the herd. Several studies, one done by Bach in Spain, the other one done actually at Virginia Tech. We were working with a Kansas farm. If I treat that animal 2 or more times, I reduce their herd life for respiratory disease. If I treat that animal 2 or more times during the pre-weaning period or any time during that animal's life, I reduce their herd life. Pretty dramatic impact. Some more work that was done in Europe. So we look at a feeding program. One was ad lib, and this is about 2 times the ME intake than the restricted. The milk replacer ad lib, a little bit lower fat, 1.6 times the ME of the restricted. And then our restricted was a 2317 milk replacer fed at about 780 grams of dry matter a day. 780 grams of dry matter a day. So pretty small sample size. So they had some numerical differences in milk production. But the big thing is they had some difference in metabolites that were related not only in calfhood, but also in the first lactation that were related to how they were fed as calves. And Dr. Van Amberg probably understands about this a little bit more. So this suggested some differences in mitochondrial function and insulin sensitivity. Other things, just to go through it pretty quick, less indication of stress, improved immune function, improved feed efficiency. You know, and that's pretty much a no-brainer. When we're feeding calves 4, sometimes even 6 quarts of milk a day or 6 liters of milk a day, there are many conditions where you're barely meeting maintenance requirements. So what's your efficiency of gain? It's horrible. It's horrible. Very expensive because all of our nutrients are going to support maintenance, and there's nothing left over for gain. Earlier age at first breeding, improved lactation performance, and again, Dr. Van Amberg is going to deal more with this. So, The other thing, just to touch on briefly, is colostrum, and it's more than just the IgG. If we look at longer-term feeding of colostrum, we feed what a lot of folks call seconds or thirds in later feedings. If we can feed all of that non-saleable pre-sale milk to calves, we see longer intestinal villi, we see improved glucose absorption. Some work that was done at Virginia Tech, if we feed fresh, dense colostrum, we have absorption of those maternal cells, and it has an impact on their immune development. There's some pretty darn exciting things happening with how we feed calves and the impact that it has on their development. So, I agree, I think we all agree that the calf's where it starts, and we're going to focus mostly on calf, but we'll talk about some of the things on the whole life cycle. So, industry standards, what's a good heifer? If I ask somebody, what's a good heifer? What's a good heifer? Besides the dits, okay, so we assume they're alive. What's a good heifer? What? Okay, healthy and good producer. Healthy and good producer. So if we look at, I think, some challenge in developing some industry standards, they should not be provincial. They had to apply to a wide cross-section of our industry. We know there's some regional differences, there's some international differences, there are differences between and within breeds. So these standards ought to be universal. They ought to be universal. And what should be the basis for this? And then really, what's the best for the animal, the industry, and for society? If we look at industry standards for calf performance and goals, is there a difference between standards and goals? Is there a difference between averages, standards, and goals? Yeah, okay? And I think a lot of times people get a little confused about that, a little bit confused. A good example is I had a heifer grower, and one of his clients said, I want my heifers coming back from your farm. These are Holsteins with 60 inches at the withers. Is that a reasonable goal? Well, I think of the Holstein breed, that's the 99th percentile. Okay? So, again, we got a little bit of a problem there. We've got a little bit of a problem. And there are some differences between standards and goals and averages. So if we look at low mortality, low cost per day, first lactation milk yield, what's wrong with these? A lot of them aren't doing a very good job of measuring. And it's a real shame that one of the speakers we had at Cornell was Darren Mann, who's a heifer grower from Idaho. And Darren can tell you what the mortalities are at different groups. He can tell you his cost per day. He can tell you his growth. And he's measuring those things. So what should guide our goals should be profit, welfare, absence of disease, and longevity. Okay. So, as I said, I was a founder of the Dairy Calf and Heifer Association, founded in '95. It's made up of dairy producers, commercial calf and heifer growers, and veterinarians, nutritionists, industry. And it was a real driving force in establishing their first attempt at some performance standards in 2009. I didn't support it. And largely because there were too many, just somebody's opinion, and we had some problems because some of them were regional, some of them were breed specific, and I think we had some challenges in those early visions. Okay, some guiding principles. We just refinished those in 2016. They should be economically justified, related to lifetime profit. There better be a positive association with animal welfare. They ought to be backed by published research or widely accepted practices from recognized industry groups, and they ought to be applicable under a wide variety of environments and available resources. Florida, Virginia, California, wherever, they ought to be related to that. So what is desirable animal performance? What are recommended standards? And I think our consumer industry and food industry is really requiring evidence that our practices support welfare, defining what welfare is. I think somebody mentioned the absence of disease. There's some great research being done at the University of British Columbia. I think it's really getting to some of the points of how do we define what welfare is, how do we define what normal versus abnormal behavior is for animals that we raise. So why don't we be leaders and promote practices backed by science rather than subjective opinions? And I think we need to be proactive and leaders rather than reactive. So our 2016 gold standards, 15 members, calf and heifer raisers, dairies and growers, allied industry, and some university professionals. So we have a pretty wide representation on that to develop that. A lot of deliberation, review, some research, and the most recent addition of that gold standards is broken up into two sections: the performance standards, which are objective and measurable, and production standards, which are things with support meeting those performance standards. So example, performance standards: growth, health, survival, reproduction. And measure all those things. Okay. Production standards support achievements of performance, and these are some of the things that we have to do to make sure we grow a good calf. Okay. Newborn care, nutrition and water, health management, employee training, housing, handling, transportation, biosecurity, and euthanasia. So, key to implementing: what do we and what can we measure on the farm? How many farms do you know that measure birth weight on calves? How many farms do you know that measure weaning weights on calves? You know, there's our problem. So why don't we do it? Too much trouble, right? Because we haven't developed a system to do it. I'll tell you, I do some work in Mexico. And so we're talking about management of these calves on this farm, and the farm manager says, yeah, come on into my office. He fires up his projector on the roof, gets his computer on, and he tells us his average daily gains at weaning, at first breeding, at pregnancy diagnosis, and at calving. Because they developed a system to do it. Gosh, if they can do it. And if you look at Darren Mann, who was on the program, as I say, at the Cornell Nutrition Conference, these are things that he does, so he's got those things. So, how many of you have not seen something like that? I hated that. I really hated those growth charts for a simple reason. I'm a Jersey guy. Okay? That's useless. That's absolutely useless. Would you agree that we have differences within the Holstein breed in terms of genetic ability for growth? Absolutely, you know, absolutely. And so those things, I think, in some ways did us a real disservice, So growth goals now are based on a percentage of mature weight of the parent. Smaller breeds, Jerseys, crossbreds, larger breeds, Holstein and Brown Swiss. Now the trouble we have is we got so many blasted crossbreds in there. But it gives us an idea of what is the average mature body weight of this herd, and then we can scale our growth goals for these replacements to those. So if we look at the various life stages of weaning, breeding, first calving. And so if we look at birth, we scale just some examples of 1,000 pounds, 1,400, 1,800, we've got it in metric. Here's our target weights at each one of those. You know, largely we look at doubling our birth weights for weaning. Kind of simple to do. Really easy to do. Okay? And we can look at weight at first breeding and then post-calving. And some people will look at 95% as a pre-calving body weight because a lot of folks are not weighing post-calving. And then it tells you what our average daily gains need to be for each one of those periods of time. Now, what about height? And here's where I have a little bit of a problem. It's highly variable, and it depends upon the breed, the genetics, and herd goals. And it's really dependent upon nutrition. I can make a short, dumpy heifer. Just don't feed them enough protein, okay? But if you've got the genes to be short, I can't feed you to make you tall, okay? And I think there's where we have some issues with the height goals. Everybody says, well, I'm not going to breed any heifers till they're this tall. Some of them could be pretty old by the time you finally get around to breeding them, okay? And it isn't because of your feeding program. And so there's where I have a little bit of trouble with some of the goals in terms of stature. Yeah, what's the challenge? With height standards, we have something like this. And Notice I had to scale this up a good bit. But that's the problem that we have with height standards. Here's one that's kind of interesting. We set goals for pneumonia, for diarrhea. This is pre-weaning, less than 10%, post-weaning, less than 10%, less than 2% for those after that, and diarrhea. So I gave this talk 2 weeks ago at a group of calf and heifer growers. And boy, there was a guy from Texas who ran about a 15,000 head calf ranch, and he literally just said, your goals are absolutely absurd. Absolutely absurd. Because he's lucky if he can hit 35% that are treated, that have, for morbidity. Now, we got into a pretty good discussion of that. Is that acceptable? 35% morbidity? You tell a consumer that 35% of these calves are going to get sick? I don't think so. I don't think so. Now, what's his problem? Okay. Now, most of these calves are shipped in 500 to 1,500 miles, and he gets a 3-day-old calf, and this guy only wants to pay him $2.60 a day. Okay? So we've got some issues there. So we wound up having a pretty good discussion on that. Are those achievable goals? You bet. You bet. Now, what it made him understand, and he understood it readily, the problem is, how do you tell the farm owner or the calf owner that we've got a problem here that needs to be dealt with? To me, it's a little bit scary. It's a little bit scary. Survival. Instead of mortality, we talk about survival. 97% survival from 24 hours to 60 days, 98, 99, and I think we turn those around. I'm not going to get into repro, but we can have goals for first service, conception rate, and pregnancy rate, which are readily measurable, and a lot of farms are going to have that. So performance standards apply regardless of the location in North America or globally. They're measurable, but we got to develop some systems for doing this. How do we do it on the farm? I was on a farm and watching somebody weed tape heifers, and I said, darn it, I'm going to do that. I'm raising 15,000 heifers, and I'm going to weed tape some animals. First of all, it's kind of dangerous, and it's not very accurate. But boy, what's it cost for a set of scales to slide into that chute and a head? Pretty cheap when we look at the whole scope of things. They need to be objective, and they need to be attainable with reasonably good management. So what's the problem with the gold standards? Well, we don't have a whole lot of data to back those up. We've got some non-standard surveys, pretty widely distributed, but some of the sample sizes are pretty small. Would everyone agree that our dairy industry has changed a lot in the last 3 or 4 years, and is likely to do so in the next 3 years? Yeah, it's, for an old geezer like me, it's exciting and scary. I was in South Dakota, and a small dairy is 1,000 cows. You go to Virginia, and I think we have 4 dairies that are above 1,500, 2,000, something like that. But things are happening. Things are happening. These are a little bit dated, and they talk more about management practices rather than performance. So if we're going to move into the next one, how do we achieve the performance standards? What are recommended practices? I want to go through these pretty quickly. Nearly every standard is supported by, these are production. In other words, what do we do? Supported by some published references. They concur with a diverse standards committee, and they support the achievement of those standards. So, newborn. Okay, the maternal environment, removal from maternity. This is one that's pretty scary. You look at Sweden, and you've got to leave that calf with the dam for a couple of days. There's one where I think we've got a real educational situation there, a real challenge. Naval disinfection, dehorning, the method, the analgesics, identification, DVD, screening, calf immunity. Nice achievable run right there. Look at either IgG levels or serum protein levels. Colostrum quality, Brix, measuring standard plate count, colostrum replacement. Oops. Fingers are too fat. Okay. and this is one that Mike's going to talk a good bit about, meeting the nutrient requirements for maintenance, for desired growth. What's growth? You guys have some lunch? They grew a little bit, right? We weighed you before and after. Put on a few pounds. Is that really growth? Okay, and the only way to do that, but what are the nutrient requirements for that? Is it going to differ in Florida as it is from Virginia or New York or South Dakota? Okay. So why don't we balance rations for calves the same way that we do for cows? That usually brings up a lot of people pretty short when they argue to me about feeding more milk. And I say, okay, we're going to lower dry matter intake on your herd to 40 pounds a day. What's that going to do? Oh, they won't milk. Same thing with calves, and guess what? They're not going to grow, or they might lose some weight. And then look at some other things. Feeding frequency, paired versus group housing. These are some welfare items right here. I'll tell you right now that do a lot of work with some of the automated calf feeding systems, and the behavior of those animals is very, very, very different. Do we actually train an animal to eat more frequently as a calf, and she might do that as a cow? To me, that's kind of exciting when we think about that. You know, we feed calves twice a day. Does that mean they're getting trained to consume their TMR as cows twice a day? And then what about water quality? You know, these are some things right here. This is one that's amazed me that I've looked on farms, and the number of farms where I see some problems with water quality that are really impeding growth and performance of those animals. Health management. Work with a DVM to develop a program and a framework by focusing on the fundamentals, having some written protocols. And here's, I'm going to be very blunt and very honest. This is a problem we have on farms. Because you ask the veterinarian, and usually they're getting ready to get back in the truck and say, man, we got some problems with your calves. Would you come on out and take a look at them? You know, what's that vet look like about that time? Covered in manure and pretty gross. Now they're going to go work with the calves. And it's a real challenge that I see on a lot of dairies, is our lack of attention to biosecurity, having a really comprehensive program that we're dealing with. Because I think on too many farms that I still see, they're all geared towards, well, what do we treat that animal once they get sick? Additional standards, employee training, housing and environment. There's some recommendations for space, for ventilation, for drainage, for handling, for animal welfare. This is something that I deal with a good bit out west. They put a 3-day-old calf in and ship them 1,000 miles to the calf grower. I think that's kind of hard to justify. There's an Amish calf grower in northern Indiana, and one of the young Mennonite men who kind of coordinates their transportation from South Dakota to Indiana, he got in the back of the trailer and rode with the calves to Indiana. It made a real different impression on him and what they do in terms of handling animals. Now, these are some things that I think we really have to deal with in our industry. Biosecurity, access to the farm, feed, milk suppliers, access to the farm by visitors. Within the farm, youngest to oldest. You know, that vet's going to come on the farm, or anybody's going to come on the farm, they start with the baby calves. And they work their way up. This isn't rocket science, but it's just good, fundamental biosecurity. And then, of course, we have some standards for euthanasia. So, future, DCHA is going to update its merits to stay current with industry trends and new research. Some of the Cornell pro-dairy goals, I think. The thing I like about this is they're very brief, very focused, and very important. I run into a lot of farms where they collect so much data that we get lost in the weeds, okay? We get lost in the weeds. But these are some of the things that are coming from pro-dairy. So the challenge, industry standards, industry statistics, herd management goals, animal welfare, and I think we have a lot of it may sound like conflicting, but I think that there are things that we must mutually consider. And this thing about consumer perceptions, I think, is especially So we're going to develop some facilities and systems to monitor performance, establish some standards related to profit and welfare. You know, just an example, and it's a system we have at Virginia Tech. These are the areas that we have heifers. We've broken that down now to about 6 groups. But my important point is we can go in with a set of slide-in scales to our chute. We identify that calf with the RFID tag the first time, and all we need to do is to wand that calf every time we run them through the scales. Everything goes into an Excel, into a file, it dumps into an Excel program, and we can identify average, monthly average daily gain, lifetime average daily gain by position on the farm. And we can do that very efficiently. This is something pretty exciting. This is the Forster Technic, and they call it their smart calf system. They can measure not only how fast that calf drinks, but how aggressively they drink. You know, calf budding, the udder of the cow, well, they measure this thing's on a hinge, and they can actually measure how aggressively that calf is eating. Now, some of the problems that we have with these calves in measuring some of the behavior is you like to establish a baseline. Unfortunately, the baseline for most baby calves is all over the place, and that's one of our big challenges. We've got activity monitors on these calves, and that's pretty good. We know that as those calves get a little bit ill, they become less active. And we can actually trigger so that this little thing will flash a red light when they, you know, when they trigger something we can measure water intake. This is available right now. We're measuring milk consumption. This is on an individual calf. Here's my feeding program. Measure moving activity, drinking speed, and we can measure drinking activity. And the beauty of measuring those things is it's all on my cell phone. You know, I've got this hooked up to 3 farms in Australia that I'm working with and can measure the behavior of those calves in the university. And so we've developed some systems for, and I think it's still in development, but for maybe establishing some standards for, better standards for calf performance. So, what are the key ones? Don't get overwhelmed with the data. This is a problem I see on a lot of farms. I'll go back to the pro dairy. What do they gain? What's the serum protein look like? But establish some really key measures that are important for identifying calf performance. Identifying calf performance that are related to that. So they ought to be objective, measurable, and achievable. They ought to be associated with farm profit. They better be supported by research. They better be supported by research. I think we have enough data now to say the better job we do of taking care of that newborn calf, of getting the early gains on that calf, returns considerable. And I think the industry must be aggressive in supporting the development of those performance standards. So thank you very much. Any questions at all? I think the calf side of things has kind of ebbs and flows a little bit, but we're realizing now, and I think this is something pretty exciting, that performance of those calves, the behavior of those calves, has a tremendous impact upon their health and their later performance. Questions?
Mortality. Probably a lot of that is due to the quality of healthcare and what you can do. But have you looked at what is the proportion of children until they get to whatever stage in their life that actually receive medication for disease? Like I look at I have 2 kids.
Yeah.
My kids are pretty healthy, but both of them at one point received antibiotics.
Yeah. I don't know if Mike's going to talk a little bit about, some things that happened during World War, that looked at children that grew up during World War II that were very ill, and the impact that that had on I guess, later growth of those. The antibiotic situation, can we justify the fact that calves coming in, if every calf that comes in, we're going to give them an antibiotic? And on these calf ranches, that's kind of the scenario that we're into. And there's where I have some trouble. I don't have any trouble with using antibiotics and using them for therapy. But for using them prophylactically, which is pretty much what happens on most of these calf ranches, that's, I think, is not defensible. And I think there's the distinction right there. The consumer thinks that we're doing that to every calf. Is 35% morbidity acceptable? I don't think so. You know, I'll look at some large dairies that have very good programs, and they're achieving those goals right there. But I think some of these really large calf ranches where we're talking about, 10, 15,000 wet calves, and their morbidity, mortalities are very low. They're probably running 2, 3, 4% mortality, but the antibiotic usage is really quite high. The question was, in terms of calf mortality, isn't it very closely related to me, it's related to what's that initial exposure of that calf in the first 6 hours? We're dealing with the calf, I like to say, it's kind of like a student when they first come to college, they're pure as the wind or the snow, and all goes but seriously, they're born in an environment where there's a heavy bacterial load. They're born they receive colostrum that has 25 million standard plate count. And they're doomed. They're absolutely doomed for achieving any kind of success. So yeah, this is something that I guess I'm very passionate about, is what's that exposure to those calves. I look at the farms that have somebody in and this is my argument with larger dairies. If I've got somebody in that calving area, maternity area, 24/7, and they're there when the calf is born, they have a beautiful maternity pen, and they feed mom's colostrum within 30 minutes, and it's low bacteria count, it's high in IgGs. Boy, it's amazing how that makes life so easy, so much easier. Questions?
I'll sneak up behind you, I've got a question.
Okay.
You obviously have a lot of experience, working with dairies. What percent of the dairies that you work with or have worked with that actually have what you'd call an acceptable standards and protocol set up for calves?
If I offend somebody, I apologize. The kind of the joke out west is with the Dutch guys, they're very thrifty. They're the ones that only want to pay $2.50 a piece. And it's a real struggle for them to understand the value of that initial investment there. And so I think some of the very progressive farms that they're going to be here 10, 15 years from now. They're talking about, these are big dairies, they're talking about making a rather substantial investment in their calf facilities. And in making a substantial investment in their maternity facilities. And I've seen that I do some teaching at the U.S. Dairy Education and Training Consortium in Clovis. And boy, there was a dairy, 10,000 cow dairy. They had built this complex. And they moved their fresh cows all the way through. They calve in a beautiful, cool facility, beautifully bedded. They milk the fresh cow immediately. She goes over into the new calf area and actually give the calf a bath, okay, then blow dry them. And I couldn't have designed better protocols. And then the cows go into an API system parlor, and they're recording data on those cows, and those cows don't leave that facility until all their problems are gone, okay, and then they move into the herd. When they move into the herd, there's no metabolic disease, there's no ready to breed. And boy, they made a phenomenal investment. It's pretty darn exciting. Because, and I think that's where I see more of the dairies going.
So curiosity, how many of you are consulting nutritionists, on-farm consulting nutritionists? It's okay, you can stick your hand up, nobody's going to point fingers at you. How many of your herds actually have what you would consider to be acceptable standards by which they measure and rate calf growth and performance? Oh, there's one back there, so everybody can swamp too.
Yeah.
So there's two people in the room, you can swamp them and ask them about it later.
It's pretty exciting when you see people doing the right thing.
Sure, absolutely. Other questions for Bob? Let's thank our speaker. Thank you.